So I know we're on a tight schedule and you've other places to be after me, so I'll get started. I'm going to go through just kind of a whistle-stop tour of the early career framework. And if we have any time, then it'd be great to hear from you guys and have any hear any questions that you have. But just to give you a bit of insight into who I am, my name is Paula Delaney. I'm currently a design manager at Ambition Institute, which is an education charity. And I mainly design curriculum content for the early career teachers programme. I was a teacher for 14 years, and kind of during that time I was head of department, I was head of faculty and member of the strategic leadership team. I'm also a school governor and I'm a national leader for Women Ed England. So like I said, this session we're going to delve into the early career framework, which I think really is starting to establish teaching as an evidence-informed profession. Not that we weren't before, but it's really putting it out there. And the reason I say that is because I was recently reading an interview with a colleague of mine from Ambition, Harry Fletcher Wood, and he was talking in the Centre for Educational Neuroscience. And he described why it's important that we have an evidence-informed approach to education by reflecting on his own experiences. And he could have been talking about my experiences of becoming a teacher and the processes and challenges that I faced. Because when I think about it, much of what I learned in my early career was through trial and error. I'd watch what others were doing, I'd see its success or failure in the classroom, and then I'd go away and try it out myself. So a lot of it was also strongly influenced by whatever trends were happening in education at the time, for want of a better word, and were being embraced by my school. So assessment for learning, ask loads of questions and keep things moving at pace. It was never really spoken about that actually you need to focus on responding to those. This is about 10 years ago now. So it was never really talked about focusing on responding to gaps in knowledge or misconceptions, because we were trying to demonstrate progress every 10 minutes. And what actually happened was, in my experience, it led to a focus on performance rather than deep learning. So activities that required pupils to really think hard were kind of discouraged because you didn't want to look like your pupils weren't making progress. And then I'd wonder why my pupils weren't remembering things. And so what I realised as I became more experienced as a teacher and kind of found my feet was that actually pupils need time to think about things, and if they're going to truly learn them, that feeling the right levels of challenge actually made my pupils engage more with the work. They liked a bit of challenge. They needed the opportunity to feel just a little bit out of their depth, but know that I was going to be there to support them if they needed me. And I realised that trial and error was a very slow process to me becoming a good teacher. And it took me a while to get where I wanted to be. And when I reflect on the impact and think about how I could have changed the lives or the outcomes for the pupils in my early career, if I'd known then what I know now. And I think that's what the early career framework is trying to do. It's trying to develop that shared understanding. So you're probably familiar with this definition or a version of it. And as teaching is becoming more evidence informed, I think we're developing this shared understanding of the concepts that actually underpin our practice. So many educators are becoming more familiar with some version of William's simple model of memory and kind of understanding how pupils actually learn. Terms like working memory, mental models, cognitive load, we're starting to see them creep more into our language. But if they're not things you're familiar with, don't worry, we're going to be talking about them today as well. But by having that clear understanding of what learning means and how that process takes place, we can better support our pupils and improve their experiences and outcomes. So my perception is that if we root our profession in evidence, we move away from being the subject of the latest fads in education towards something that becomes more sustainable in our practice. And we have time as educators to build our expertise. And that's in an ideal world. If we can get things right, we're not going to be susceptible to those fads that some of us maybe have felt previously in our careers. So thinking about that, how can the early career framework actually help? Well, this is the offer. This is what the Department of Education is proposing that it would look like. I'll give you a moment to just have a quick read of that. So it's 2 years of NQT as opposed to the previously one. We're previously having 1 year. The programme looks at support over assessment, though there is that formal assessment element. It will continue to exist separately. But what we're seeing as well is a significant role for mentors. And I realised this when I was doing research, research across colleagues for my own work, that mentors can make or break an early career teacher's experience. And that's why I think we're finally realising that we need to invest and give mentors the time to develop. So early rollout is starting in 2020. And there are 4 providers for the early rollout. I work for Ambition Institute, but there are other providers as well. Now, initially, the early rollout was in kind of 3 general geographical areas. However, due to kind of the situation we've found ourselves in, and the fact that a lot of NQTs have missed out on classroom practice, they've still been continuing lectures online, those trainee teachers, but the NQTs we will have in September will have missed out on a chunk of practice, class time practicing in the classroom. So that's why the early career, sorry, just realised I need to admit some more people here, apologies. So that's why there is an expansion of the early career rollout, and that may be impacting some of you. So what we're thinking about here is the kind of content of the early career framework. It covers these general areas. But what I'm going to do is take us through kind of each of the different standards that's been laid out around and consider what that can do, what that really means in practice. So what that's going to mean in practice, and also what can we learn and take away from it and develop in our own practice in the classroom. So if we think about the first focus is on high expectations. And looking at the early career framework, I've kind of pulled out on the left-hand side these factors that have been identified. So they really highlight teacher impact, the difference that teachers can make to the outcomes for a pupil. The idea that teachers are role models and the responsibility that they undertake for the learning environment in the classroom cultures. It also highlights that need to build relationships of trust, and clear behavioural expectations are really highlighted as part of this as well. But also as part of that, what's not explicitly said, but I think we should really be aware of as well, and it might be that we're thinking about this where our early career teachers, if we're part of the early rollout in September or the national rollout when it happens September 21, we might just want to think about it in our own schools. Some key factors to consider include things like challenging labelling and stereotypes. So we might not even be aware that we hold these biased or preconceptions about certain pupils and their ideas and what their prior learning and experience is, or the expectations that we might have of them. So I know recently the book Boys Don't Try has really kind of brought to the forefront some of the labels and stereotypes that we had around boys in education. And it's how we might have treated them differently. So really being aware of what expectations we're setting, and are there any labels and stereotypes that we hold that are limiting those expectations? Alignment in our words and actions as well. I don't know about you, but after over a decade in the classroom, nobody will call you out and tell you that they don't believe you more than a sixth form student will, or even a secondary student, any age in secondary school I found. So if we are telling pupils that we have high expectations and we believe they can do things and we believe they can be successful, then our actions need to support that. We need to be actually putting in place the things, the scaffolds and supports that are going to help them to be successful. And finally, consistency. Being consistent in those high expectations, not letting them slip, knowing, and that helps us to create that environment and classroom culture where our pupils feel safe, and it helps to build the trusting relationships. The second standard, don't worry, this won't be up for long, how pupils learn. And this is what it actually looks like in the document. But I'm going to take it and put it in a slightly different format, because how pupils learn, in my opinion, underpins everything else that comes after it in the framework. So thinking about how pupils learn, it's useful to use Willingham's simple model of memory. Now, I have in the references put a hyperlink to kind of where you can get this, access this for free, and you might want to share it among your staff or share it with your early career teachers when they join as well. So I have got reference lists at the end, and I've tried to hyperlink. Some of it's taken from the early career framework, but I've tried to hyperlink free to access articles and pieces that are quite manageable and not going to be too onerous. But Willingham's simple model of memory, like I said, if we can understand how pupils learn, then this can help us to, everything else will build off this. So the first thing that's stated in the framework is learning involves a lasting change in pupils' capabilities or understanding. If pupils have actually learned something, then they will be able to do, know, understand something in the long term. And that's where long-term memory comes into play. It's going to be in their long-term memory. Sorry, I'm just admitting people at the same time here. Okay. The second thing to think about is prior knowledge plays an important role in how pupils learn. So committing some key facts in their long-term memory is likely to help them to learn more complex ideas. And we'll come back to that again when we look at the subject section. We're also thinking here about an important factor in memory to know is that it comprises of these two elements. So we have working memory and we have long-term memory. And being really aware of the function of each of those elements and how they interplay. So working memory is where information that is being actively processed is held. So that could mean thinking, that's where thinking takes place. And it will be information from the environment combined with information from long-term memory. But we need to be aware that the amount of information that working memory can hold differs from person to person. And there are many factors which can influence that, the complexity of an activity, or if you've prior knowledge of something or prior experience of it. Number 5 here looks at long-term memory. And it can be considered as the store of knowledge that changes as pupils learn by integrating new ideas with existing knowledge. So knowledge that they have acquired through thinking and processing becomes stored as schema or mental models in that long-term memory. And it's important that we understand the interplay between long-term memory and working memory. So, for example, if I see a car on the road in front of me, that's in my environment, okay, it's around me. In my long-term memory, I know cars exist, and if I'm walking and a pedestrian, I associate a certain level of danger with them. Both of those pieces of information are combined in my working memory to make me a little bit more cautious and ensure that I stay in the footpath and don't step out in front of a car. And it makes sure that I can safely cross the road. And that's something we need to be aware of, is how things work together and interplay. Where knowledge is weak, our pupils are likely to develop misconceptions, and particularly this can happen if we introduce new ideas too quickly. when we don't have to think hard enough, or we don't practice retrieving information from our long-term memories over time, we may struggle to actually recall information at a later date, or it may be incomplete. But regular purposeful practice of what has previously been taught can help to consolidate that material and help our pupils to remember what's learned. If we practice retrieving and using knowledge, we can develop both storage strength, so how accurately we can recall the information, and also our retrieval strength, so how quickly or how much effort is required for us to recall it. Requiring people to retrieve that information from memory and spacing that practice so that you revisit ideas after a gap is likely to strengthen that recall and develop fluency. So pupils know the content and they can recall it and use it in different contexts. The final element that's mentioned in understanding how pupils learn is the worked example. And that can be from our environment. We provide the worked examples where we show pupils new processes and support them to learn. Okay, so like I said, this is standard 2. By understanding and having a very clear understanding of this, everything else in the early career framework builds upon it. So thinking about subject and knowledge, talking about standard 3 here, I've just pulled out some of the key elements and put them on the left here. So when we're talking about subject and curriculum, it's important that early career teachers, and I suppose any teacher within the school environment, knows the school's curriculum, vision and values. So we know what the purpose of learning is in that school environment. And different schools will have different visions, values, ethos around what they want pupils to learn, what they want pupils to be able to do, and what they want pupils to use that learning for. And it's important that we know that our early career teachers know where they fit into that vision and values, because that will then inform the subject vision and values. And in turn, it will inform the vision and values that that teacher brings into the classroom. And if we want it to be shared, if we want early career teachers coming into our schools to have that shared vision and values, we need to be quite explicit about telling them what it is. And long-term planning is where we're going to have that shared vision and values for our subject. So by sharing with our early career teachers and as a department or as a phase or as a year group, what we want our pupils to know and be able to do at the end of their time with us, we can also help our teachers to ensure they have secure subject knowledge. So that teachers, if they know what they're going to be teaching in the long term, can start to ensure that they do a subject knowledge audit and are building up the knowledge as they go along. Because I know, being a history and sociology teacher and moving from Ireland to the UK to teach history, whereas I thought I had quite secure subject knowledge, when I moved to a completely different curriculum and completely different context, actually, I didn't have the history knowledge, the subject knowledge I needed. And I was doing quite well. I was a year in that school. And I thought, okay, right, I got the history subject knowledge down. But then I moved school and I realised, actually, okay, this history department has a different curriculum and a different interpretation. So I needed to build my subject knowledge. But by having those long-term plans in place, that can help our early career teachers to identify where they need to build their subject knowledge. If we have secure subject knowledge, if our teachers have secure subject knowledge, then they can help our pupils to master those foundational concepts and knowledge. And this goes back to the simple model of memory, where we want those concepts to be stored in long-term memory. We want pupils to have a really solid understanding so that they can retrieve them and use them and apply them in different contexts. So things like, if I was thinking history, things like understanding chronology. So having a good understanding of chronology, that pupils knew what came before and what came after. And that wouldn't be something that I'd have to tackle every time I came back to it. Or if I think about something like the concept of an heir, and starting with the Battle of Hastings and talking about how not having an heir to the throne became a problem there, and really building that concept of, and that key term, building their knowledge of what that means. Then when we come to the Tudors, and we talk about Henry VIII, the fact that he doesn't have an heir or he doesn't have a male heir, it's something they're familiar with already. So they have that knowledge they can keep coming back to. Explicit instruction here also comes under subject and curriculum. Now, explicit instruction can be quite divisive, and I think there might be some misconceptions out there about what we mean by that. We're not talking about standing up and talking for 50 minutes at our pupils or whatever length of time your lessons are. What we're talking about here is telling pupils, giving pupils the knowledge, telling them what you want them to do, and actually then engaging them in guided practice where you're supporting them before letting them have independence. So explicit instruction, you might only be speaking to the pupils for 5 minutes at a time before you give them support and scaffolding so they can practice before they move on to potentially independent practice. Our anticipating misconceptions is based in that secure subject knowledge, and the early career framework does encourage the early career teachers to build relationships, professional relationships with their colleagues to help anticipate the misconceptions that pupils may have and try and tackle them head on. Now, you might not think some misconception, there might be some misconceptions that you'd never think might exist. I can tell you as a history teacher, having a pupil ask me when the world stopped being in black and white was one I could never have prepared for. But it happened, and we had to tackle that misconception because all the sources we used in history, the pictures in the early 20th century we were using for like World War I were in black and white, and that child thought that the world had been in black and white. So I could never have anticipated that misconception, but there are other misconceptions that probably are more generalized and we can kind of anticipate as a subject department or as a year group or as a phase group together. Linking learning to developmental models as well. So this comes back to our understanding of how knowledge is stored in long-term memory and how that knowledge can be built over time. So actually saying to pupils, so if I go back to my example of the heir, saying to pupils, so Henry VIII needed an heir. Do you remember when we talked about the Battle of Hastings and what the challenge was there and why the Battle of Hastings happened? So actually developing their understanding and mental models. And the final key component on subject and curriculum is literacy. And if we're going to understand, if we're going to introduce new concepts and new language, explicitly teaching that language and not just teaching the word, but actually how to pronounce it and how it might look in a sentence. So really taking the time to understand what are the different terminology and concepts that we're going to be using in our subject area or in our different topics, and actually explicitly teaching that and developing the pupil's understanding of that language. So that's the subject and curriculum section. Classroom practice then. So again, we're working on the foundations of the simple model of memory, introducing new material and steps. That goes back to avoiding that cognitive overload. So avoiding introducing too much information at once, because we know working memory has a limited capacity and can only process a small number of chunks of information. And the research varies in this, but it suggests between 3 and 5 pieces of information we can hold in our mind at once, depending on the complexity, for about 15 to 30 seconds. So that's why we need to be breaking things down into smaller components as we introduce them. Again, linking those ideas to prior learning to make sure that we're building on what pupils know and are able to do previously, and helping them recall the knowledge that's going to help them build this new learning. Guides, scaffolds and worked examples. Rosenshine's principles of instruction are great guidance on that, and I've put them in the reference list as well. But here we're talking about not differentiating our pupils by giving them different worksheets, but actually differentiating by the support that we give and the guidance that we're giving so they can achieve success. Teaching pupils metacognitive strategies as well, and I think inadvertently we've managed to do that now in this current context, so that they have to plan, monitor and evaluate their own learning, but actually taking as pupils develop more and more in subject areas and they're getting more confident, helping them to plan, monitor and evaluate some independent tasks. In our classroom practice as well, questioning is a key element of this. And thinking about what questioning is used for. What are the different functions of it? So checking for understanding, but also developing understanding and being really conscious of why we're asking the questions and what the function is. And also the early career framework is asking us to avoid using questioning as a way of behaviour management. We'll come to behaviour in a moment or two. So classroom talk is the other is another key element in this phase, in this section, but we're talking about actually being very clear and structured when we pair up pupils or we put them into groups, that we're thinking about what do we want them to talk about, how are we guiding it, how are we scaffolding it, and actually what do we want the outcome of that conversation to be. And finally, practice. Opportunities to practice, whether that's guided with teacher support and going through step by step, or whether it's independent practice, but really setting up those opportunities. The next thing we need to think about is adaptive teaching. And the one thing the framework is very clear about is there is no evidence that learning styles exist. And for somebody who 10 years ago was trained in multiple learning styles and how to assess their pupils, when I started reading more evidence informed and trying to develop more evidence informed practice, that came as a bit of a shock to me. But it does explicitly say in the framework, it's while they're learning styles, there's no evidence to say they suggest. Well, pupils might have learning preferences. They might enjoy sitting down and watching a video clip, but a preference is very different. I would probably prefer to be eating chocolate as opposed to fruit, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's good for me. So it's very explicit in the early career framework on that. Being aware that pupils require different levels and types of support, and our guides and scaffolding help with that as well. Understanding pupils' difference and prior knowledge and potential barriers. And we can see that everything's building on the previous layer, so subject knowledge here, and knowing what pupils have learned maybe earlier in the curriculum, and also having an understanding of our subject, the topic we're teaching, and what are the particularly challenging concepts. I know as a sociology teacher, when I was teaching Marxism, things like communism were concepts that pupils really struggled with. Maintaining high expectations here, and that's again comes back to how you differentiate, that we're not limiting pupils, and going back to that labelling as well, we're not limiting pupils in the content or in the expectations that we're setting of them, that we are actually providing opportunities and scaffolding so that they're able to access all learning. And really importantly, and it comes up in multiple sections of the early career framework, is the importance of liaising with others to support pupils, especially those with special educational needs or disabilities. And it does explicitly mention working with parents and carers, as well as those individuals within the school environment. Assessment then. So assessment, it's really explicit, thinking about well-being and thinking about our workload. Make sure your assessment has a clear purpose. And if we're doing assessment for learning opportunities, that clear purpose should be linked to the learning objective. So your end of lesson assessment should be linked to what you're actually doing in the lesson. We should, when we assess, be very clear on the difference between learning and performance. So learning is that relatively permanent change in a behaviour and knowledge that's stored in long-term memory, whereas performance is that immediate behaviour or knowledge that can be observed and measured. And this involves the information being held in working memory, but it's not necessarily in long-term memory yet. Because learning happens inside a pupil's mind, we can't measure it directly, but we can make inferences about a pupil's learning based on their performance in assessment. So it's really important that we're embedding assessment opportunities into learning so that we can begin to make those inferences about pupils and avoid pitfalls like thinking just because I taught it, they learnt it. This will help us to check that. Also, assessment will help us check prior knowledge and any of those misconceptions or gaps in knowledge that our pupils have in long-term memory before we introduce new learning and build upon it. Key to this as well, and it comes up in the early career framework, is planning to respond. And with our early career teachers, whereas when we develop more experience and expertise, we kind of automatically respond, but making it okay that our early career teachers might have to just say, okay, I'm just going to reteach you that little bit of learning. Or it might be about providing quality feedback. And again, we're early career teachers, we're thinking about what is this feedback designed to do? And thinking about feedback as something that's going to close the learning loop. That is going to make, it's not going to be just about right or wrong, that it's going to make the difference between pupils being able to do something that they couldn't do previously. And feedback can come in many forms. It can be something from just the specific task, targeted on rewrite this specific element. It can be the subject in general, so it can be something kind of disciplinary, and you can tell my history teacher was coming through, is think about the nature, origin, purpose of a source when you're looking at source utility. Self-regulation is what we're aiming to do, to develop that self-regulation where pupils understand how they actually learn and are able to regulate their own learning. And finally, we should avoid self-evaluation, so things that focus on the child or the individual themselves. So when we think about Standard 7, we're talking about managing behaviour effectively. And part of this is around establishing reinforcing norms. Surprisingly enough, developing those routines and reinforcing them comes back to memory, because when we have fluency and automaticity in those routines, it frees up working memory to focus on other elements that we want students to do, such as kind of what they're learning, as opposed to thinking about where's my book, what do I do with my coat, where should I sit. So those routines are really important to free up the capacity of working memory to focus on learning. Positive reinforcement, where possible, is about creating that positive learning environment. It's good for our own well-being as well as the pupils' well-being if we can be working in a positive environment. We're trying to assume that pupils are trying to do the right thing and think about how we can help them further to be successful in that. So if a pupil is not following instruction, repeat the instruction initially. It might be they just didn't hear you, or maybe they didn't understand it. And it's important that we have clarity of instruction as well. And that gives us that predictable and secure environment, because we want our pupils to feel happy and secure coming into our classroom. Supporting pupils to self-regulate our emotions. And we go back to that very first standard that we're looking at with high expectations, where we are role models, and actually setting that as a standard that we regulate our emotions. And even when things are a little bit challenging and not going exactly as we might have wanted, that we don't shout, we don't raise our voice, and that we're actually managing our emotions, and that we expect our pupils to do the same. Developing pupils' resilience and belief about their ability to succeed. It goes back to how we actually develop our lessons and how we develop our curriculum to ensure that learning takes into account prior knowledge, that we help pupils address misconceptions and overcome any gaps in knowledge that they have, and scaffold and support them so that they can feel success. Because if they have an element of success, but even when it's not successful, they're in a safe environment, they will feel like they can try again. Because if they've been successful in the past, they know they can be successful again in the future. But it depends on how much support we give them as the teacher and the adult in that room. Building effective relationships is a really important one as well. So when we think about this, getting to know our pupils, what their goals and interests are, and how then we link their goals and interests to what we're doing in the classroom, what we're asking them to learn. So it might be about finding out what they want to do down the line, what do they want to be, or what area they want to work in, or what they're interested in, and linking what we're doing in the classroom to what matters to the pupils. When we think about pupils' motivation, intrinsic factors are just as significant and important, and even more so possibly, than the extrinsic factors. Don't underestimate the reward of a feeling of success and feeling valued. And again, it goes back to the first thing that we talked about when we talked about being authentic and aligning your words and actions in that showing people that you value them and that they can be successful. And that can be just as powerful as merits and stickers will be, and possibly have much longer lasting effects and impacts for them. Pupils' prior experiences and perceptions of success and failure are going to impact how they behave in the classroom. Pupils may come to you with baggage that has nothing to do with you. And we need to work to build those relationships and help them leave the baggage at the door. I've had pupils before who have had maybe not been quite successful in a subject area in the past, and just not on a personal level, but just associated me with the subject and therefore disliked me. But it took time to build that relationship and realise that I was different from my subject, and I was there to try and help and support them. Standard 8. So everything we've focused on so far, and bring it right back to Willingham's simple model of memory, we're focusing on avoiding overloading working memory by taking into account pupils' prior knowledge from planning. So thinking about that in both subject and just as a subject and entire curriculum, but also in a single lesson as well. Breaking complex material down into smaller steps and using examples and models to help pupils achieve that. Reducing distractions that take attention away from what is actually being taught. So really manage our environment, because managing that behaviour takes away any distractions and allows pupils to focus on the learning. And that managing distractions also comes down to the complexity of a task and keeping the complexity at a minimum so that the attention is really focused on the content we want them to focus on, and that working memory does not become overloaded. Building on pupils' prior knowledge by identifying those possible misconceptions through assessment and planning in our instruction how we could prevent them from ever forming in the first place. If we find and unpick assessments, we need to work to try and overcome them as well. Linking what pupils already know to what is being taught, explaining how that new content builds on what they already know and they've already done. And that can help them to value the new learning even more, because they can see a sense that they've already been successful in elements of this previously. And that can kind of build their sense of inquiry and inquisitiveness, and how does this link and how can I build it and develop it more? Sequencing the lessons so that pupils have that secure foundational knowledge before encountering more complex content. And that's across a sequence of lessons in a curriculum or subject, but that can also be within the lesson, carefully sequencing learning. Encouraging pupils to share their emerging understanding and any points of confusion or misconceptions, and actually actively creating the culture in our classroom where pupils feel comfortable to do that, and that safe and secure learning environment. If pupils have misconceptions, they feel comfortable to share them and we can address them. And they feel that also helps to build that sense of resilience, that they're willing to try again, that getting something wrong is a learning experience, and that it's something that actually we can learn and move on from. And finally, increasing that likelihood of material being retained by balancing kind of exposition, repetition, practice, retrieval, all those critical kind of skills and knowledge as well, so that we can plan regular review and practice of key ideas and concepts over time in order to do that. Designing practice and retrieval tasks that provide support so that pupils experience a high success rate when they are attempting challenging work as well. So this is where our scaffolding and guidance is really important. And then we can start to increase the challenge with practice and retrieval as knowledge becomes more secure, and removing the scaffolding and kind of lengthening the space between practice or introducing new and more complex problems for pupils to solve. But I think you'll see all of the different elements rely on having that solid understanding of how pupils learn, and then building on it with all the other elements, whether that's subject and curriculum, and the classroom instruction, assessment, or the behaviour elements as well. And what the Early Career Framework is trying to encourage teachers to do is engage in and manage their own professional development as well. By going back to that very first standard and thinking about how teachers can impact pupil outcomes, it's trying to build that love of learning among our early career teachers as well, and the focus of to keep developing and keep getting better. So thinking about effective professional development that's evidence informed, reflective practice as well, so that teachers are thinking about what's working in their classroom and why it's working, and ensuring that that's an evidence informed approach. Thinking about the contributions to the wider life of the school as well, and that can help teachers to build relationships with the pupils. However, we need to be really cautious with our early career teachers that we are managing their workload and well-being on that element. We should also support them in building effective relationships with parents, carers and families, and that will vary from school to school. So we need to be very clear on what the guidance is and how we do that within our school. And developing those relationships with teaching assistants, SENCOs, pastoral leads, careers advisor, any other specialist colleagues that can help and support them in this context and in this environment. So being very clear with your early career teachers and signposting those individuals, making the introductions as well so that they know who they are and who they can go to if they want support and if they want help. Particularly if we go back to the adapting teaching for pupils with individual needs or disabilities, then we need to think about the role that the SENCO and possibly teaching assistants play in that dynamic, and the importance of building those strong relationships so we can share knowledge and information and understanding on that to ensure that the pupil feels supported in the classroom. So the reason we're looking at professional behaviours and high quality professional development is because we have now come to realise that it's a bit of a myth. I suppose Kraft and Pape, or Pape and Kraft's 2016 paper, talk about the myth of the plateau in teacher development, that actually teachers can keep getting better. And if we develop early on in our early career teachers that desire to develop and engage in evidence-informed practice and high quality professional development, then we can keep that going over time. And actually creating a culture in our school where professional development is valued and seen as something that's part of our culture and the norm. Because really, the people who are going to benefit from this work, as we can see from the evidence, are our pupils, and it's going to impact their outcomes significantly. So, taking a quote from Dylan Mulliam, have a moment to read this slide. And it resonates true. Every teacher needs to improve, not because they're not good enough, but because they can be even better. And we need to be thinking about now, in preparation for our early career teachers, whether they're coming in September 2020 or whether it's for the early rollout of so that's the early rollout is September 2020, or whether we're thinking 2021, we need to be developing that shared understanding among our own staff, as well as supporting our early career teachers. So we as more experienced teachers might be doing things, but we might not use the same terminology. So what we want to think about is what professional development can we put in place now to develop that shared language so that our early career teachers, and indeed because the framework for initial teacher training is modelled on the early career teacher, the early career framework, terminology and language is overlapping, and it's a very kind of clear progression between the two. So if that's what our early career teachers are learning, we want to make sure that we have a shared language with the teachers that we already have in our schools as well, and that we have that shared understanding. So thinking about what professional development are we going to go back and put in place to make sure that at a very starting point, we have a clear understanding of how pupils learn, and then building other elements upon that. So to help you do that, I've got some key reading here. Now, I tried to be selective in the key reading. Yes, some of it has come from the Early Career Framework, but I've also tried to select things that are freely available and kind of, where possible, short-ish reads. So it's not going to take too much time. If we have a look at, I have put in here the Education Endowment Foundation as a reference, but within that, there are multiple research papers, multiple evidence reviews. So most topics or areas that your teachers or early career teachers would want to develop their practice in, they'll possibly or probably find a paper or some useful resources in the Education Endowment Foundation page. So thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. I hope I've helped you to get an understanding of the Early Career Framework, what we kind of need to know, and what we can learn from it and use to develop our own practice. Remember, it's not because we're not good, but because we can always keep getting better. My name is Paula Delaney, and if you have any questions, or you want to get in contact, my Twitter handle is @PaulaE Delaney. So thank you again, and I hope you have a lovely evening.